She never had a family, so there's no point in looking for a donor. It's a shame, but there's not much we can do in cases like this. I stopped abruptly in the hospital corridor, my hand still shaking from the farewell I had just said in room 243. The nurses were talking quietly near the station, unaware of my presence behind the broken coffee machine. Yeah, Sarah was always kind of an orphan. She grew up in foster care, never knew her biological family. Her husband is devastated, poor guy. My heart raced. Sarah. My Sarah. They were talking about my wife as if she were already dead. My name is John Mitchell, I'm 32 years old, and 5 minutes ago I said goodbye to the woman I love, thinking it was forever. Sarah is in the final stages of severe aplastic anemia, and without a bone marrow transplant, the doctors say she has at most 2 weeks to live. But something in the nurse's conversation bothered me deeply. Sarah always told me she had no family. She grew up in foster homes since she was a baby and never knew her biological parents. So when the diagnosis came, we already knew that the chances of finding a compatible donor were almost non-existent. People without close relatives depend on luck to find a compatible stranger in the National Registry. A luck that, apparently, Sarah would never have. I went back 3 months ago, when it all started. Sarah had started to get too tired for our morning walks. Then came the unexplained purple spots, the shortness of breath, the paleness that haunted me every night when I watched her sleep. The diagnosis was a punch in the stomach. Severe aplastic anemia. Her bone marrow had simply stopped producing healthy blood cells. Without treatment, it would be fatal. With a transplant, she would have an 80% chance of a complete cure. The problem? We needed a compatible donor. Siblings were the best option, then parents, cousins. People with the same blood. Sarah had no one. We joined the National Donor Registry, but the doctors were honest, it could take months or years to find a match. Sarah didn't have that kind of time. During those 3 months, I watched my wife waste away day after day. The woman who built furniture with me on weekends, who laughed too loudly at the movies, who made heart-shaped pancakes on Saturdays, was turning into a pale and fragile version of herself. Yesterday, when Dr. Peterson called me in to talk, I already knew what he was going to say. John, we need to prepare for the worst. Sarah is no longer responding to transfusions. Without a miracle, she has only a few days left. That's when I made the hardest decision of my life. I walked into her room, held her cold hand, and said the words I never thought I'd say, I love you, Sarah. And I'll always love you. Thank you for being my wife. She smiled weakly and whispered, take good care of our garden, John. The roses will need you. I left that room devastated, certain that I would never speak to her again while she was conscious. That's when I overheard the nurses talking. And something didn't add up. Sarah was always a bit of an orphan. Always? What do you mean, always? Sarah was 28 years old. How could a nurse know everything about her life? I hid behind the coffee machine, forcing my breathing to calm down, and continued listening. I remember when she first came here, still a teenager. She must have been about 15. Always alone, no one from her family ever came to visit her. 15. Sarah never told me she had been in this hospital before. In fact, she always said she avoided doctors, that she was afraid of hospitals because she hadn't had good experiences as a child. The other nurse lowered her voice even more, yeah, and to think that her family doesn't even know she exists. All that confusion with the adoption records in the 90s was terrible. So many children lost in the system. Confusion with adoption records? A family that doesn't know she exists? I felt my world spin. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what I discovered next changed everything. Because suddenly, I realized that maybe Sarah wasn't as orphaned as we thought. What if someone had deliberately hidden information about her family? What if there were compatible donors out there, but something or someone was keeping them away from her? My goodbye to Sarah might have been premature. What if there was a whole family looking for her, not knowing where to find her? I couldn't leave that hallway. I stood there like a ghost, processing every word I had heard. Confusion with adoption records in the 90s. A family that doesn't know Sarah exists. The nurses had already left, but her words echoed in my mind like a hammer. I pulled out my cell phone and began searching obsessively, problems with Tennessee adoption records in the 90s. What I found made my blood run cold. Dozens of articles about scandals in the state adoption system. Children separated from families who were looking for them. Altered records, documents mysteriously lost, families destroyed by corrupt bureaucracy. And at the center of it all, one name appeared again and again: Dr. Margaret Henley, former director of the Davidson County Department of Children's Services between 1988 and 2003. My heart raced. Sarah was born in 1995, right in the middle of this woman's tenure. I ran back into the hospital, straight to Sarah's room. She was asleep, hooked up to tubes and machines, her skin so pale it looked transparent. I sat down next to the bed and held her cold hand. "Sarah," I whispered, "I need to ask you something." She opened her eyes slowly, giving me that weak smile that broke my heart. "Do you remember anything about your adoption? Any details, any names?" Sarah frowned, confused. "John, honey, you know I don't have that information. The records were all lost in a fire at the office when I was 5. That's what I've been told my whole life." Fire. Lost records. How convenient. "And you never tried to look for your biological family?" "Of course I have," she whispered, her tears beginning to fall. "When I turned 18, I went to the Department of Children's Services. A very serious woman told me there was absolutely nothing. No records, no leads. That my biological parents were probably drug addicts who abandoned me and never looked back." "Do you remember the name of that woman?" Sarah closed her eyes, concentrating. "She was a doctor. Margaret something. She was very rude to me, said I was wasting my time looking for people who clearly didn't want me." Margaret. Dr. Margaret Henley. I felt anger boiling inside me. That woman had lied directly to my wife. She had looked into the eyes of an 18-year-old girl and deliberately destroyed any hope she had of finding her family. "Sarah, I need to go out for a few hours. But I promise I'll be back." "Where are you going?" "To take care of something," I said, kissing her forehead. "Trust me." Dr. Margaret Henley's house was in Belle Meade, one of Nashville's most elegant neighborhoods. An imposing mansion with perfectly manicured gardens, wrought iron gates, and a black Mercedes in the driveway. 45 years of public service had been very generous to her. I rang the doorbell, my heart pounding. A woman in her 70s opened the door, well-dressed, her gray hair perfectly coiffed, and an air of superiority that could be felt from miles away. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking me up and down with disdain. "Dr. Henley? My name is John Mitchell. My wife is Sarah Carter, formerly Sarah from the county adoption system. Do you remember her?" The woman's face changed instantly. For a split second, I saw panic in her eyes. Then she regained her mask of indifference. "I don't remember every child who's come through the system, young man. There have been thousands over the years." "You remember Sarah," I insisted. "She came looking for information about her biological family when she turned 18. You told her there were no records." Margaret narrowed her eyes. "If I said there were no records, then there were no records. Now, if you'll excuse me." She started to close the door, but I put my foot in the way. "My wife is dying, Dr. Henley. She needs a bone marrow transplant. She needs to find family. And I believe you know exactly where that family is." Margaret laughed. A cold, cruel laugh. "Even if I did, what makes you think I'd help? Some children are better left where they are. Some families are better kept apart." "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, leaning closer, "that your wife was one of the lucky ones. She had a decent life in foster homes. She wasn't beaten, abused, or neglected like she would have been if she'd stayed with that family of unsuitable people." Unsuitable people. The words came out of her mouth like poison. "You deliberately separated Sarah from her biological family?" "I saved a child from a life of misery," Margaret replied coldly. "The parents were too young, too poor, unsuitable to raise a child properly. The girl had a better chance in the system. But she had a right to know. She had a right to choose. She had a right to be protected from the stupid decisions of irresponsible adults," she retorted. "And look how she turned out. She grew up, got married, had a normal life. Until she got sick, of course." The casual way she mentioned Sarah's illness made me see red. "Do you realize my wife could die because of what you did?" I didn't give her the disease, young man. Life happens. Some people are lucky, some aren't. Margaret shrugged with an indifference that made me sick. Now get off my property before I call the police. The door slammed in my face with a final bang. I stood there, shaking with rage. This woman had literally played God with my wife's life. She had arbitrarily decided that Sarah was better off without her biological family, condemning her to a lifetime of loneliness and now possibly death. I got back in the car and sat there for 20 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Margaret Henley knew. She knew where Sarah's family was, but she refused to tell us out of pure prejudice and arrogance. I thought about my wife lying in that hospital bed, wasting away because we couldn't find a compatible donor. I thought about all the years she had spent feeling completely alone in the world, not knowing that she might have parents, brothers, sisters, cousins somewhere looking for her. All because of one woman who decided she knew what was best for everyone. I grabbed my cell phone and started researching everything I could about Margaret Henley. Her career, her reputation, her personal life. If she wanted to play this game, I would play it too. But first, I needed to find Sarah's family. And if Margaret wasn't going to help me voluntarily, I would find other means. Because my wife was not going to die because of the arrogance and prejudice of a corrupt bureaucrat. If Margaret Henley thought she could continue controlling Sarah's life even after all these years, she was about to find out how wrong she was. The real battle was just beginning. When I returned to the hospital, Sarah was worse. Much worse. The machines surrounding her bed beeped more frequently, and a new nurse checked her vital signs every 15 minutes. Her skin had a gray pallor that made my stomach churn. "Where were you?" she whispered when she saw me, her voice so weak that I had to lean in to hear her. "Taking care of something important," I said, taking her cold hand. "Sarah, I need to tell you something." I told her everything. About the nurse's conversation, about Margaret Henley, about how our search for her family had been sabotaged from the start. Sarah listened silently, tears streaming down her thin face. "So, maybe I have a family," she whispered. "I'm sure you do. And I'm going to find them." That night, Sarah went into crisis. Her body completely rejected the last transfusion, and the doctors had to sedate her to stabilize her vital signs. Dr. Peterson took me out into the hallway. "John, we need to be realistic. Sarah has a week at most, maybe less. If you have any hope of finding a donor." "That's exactly what I'm doing," I interrupted. I spent the entire night at the computer in the waiting room, researching everything I could find about Margaret Henley and the adoption record scandal. What I found made me furious beyond measure. Margaret hadn't acted alone. She was part of a systematic scheme that separated children from families deemed unfit, code for poor, young, or minority. Dozens of court cases, hundreds of families destroyed, thousands of children who grew up believing they had no one in the world. And all these children had one thing in common: their biological families never stopped looking for them. The next morning, I called the law firm that had represented several families against Margaret Henley. The secretary transferred me to Amanda Rodriguez, a lawyer specializing in adoption cases. "Mr. Mitchell," she said after I explained the situation, "your wife's case sounds exactly like the others we've investigated. You said she was born in 1995. "That's right. That was one of the busiest years of Henley's scheme. She was literally selling babies to wealthy families while telling the biological families that the children had died or been adopted out of state." My blood ran cold. Selling babies. It was a black market disguised as a legitimate adoption program. Children from poor families were separated and placed with families who paid exorbitant fees. The biological families were discouraged or given false information. "How can I find Sarah's family?" Amanda paused. Normally, this would take months of legal investigation. But, she sighed, "I have something that might help." We managed to recover some of Henley's original records during one of the lawsuits. Records she swore she destroyed. My heart raced. "You have Sarah's records?" "I can check. But, Mr. Mitchell, I need to be honest. Even if we find her family, do the compatibility tests, arrange a transplant, that takes time. Time your wife may not have." "Leave that to me," I said. "Just give me the names." 2 hours later, Amanda called me back. "John, I found something. Sarah isn't an only child like Margaret said. She has 2 older brothers and a younger sister. Her parents, Maria and Carlos Delgado, lived in Nashville until 2005, when they moved to Memphis. They're still looking for Sarah to this day. I grabbed a piece of paper and began frantically writing. Do you have their current address? I have everything. Phone number, address, even where they work. John. Amanda's voice became emotional. They never stopped looking. Every week they call child services asking for updates on the daughter they lost when she was 8 months old. 8 months. Sarah was taken from her family when she was only 8 months old. Margaret told her parents that Sarah had died of pneumonia in the hospital, Amanda continued. They had an empty funeral, John. They buried an empty coffin. The anger I felt at that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just for Sarah, it was for the entire Delgado family, for all the years of unnecessary suffering, for every birthday they spent crying for a daughter who was alive just a few hours away. I'm heading to Memphis right now, I said. John, you should call first. No. This can't be done over the phone. I went back to Sarah's room. She was awake, but her eyes had lost much of their sparkle. I sat down beside the bed and held her hands. Sarah, I found your family. She blinked slowly. What? Her parents, Maria and Carlos Delgado. 2 brothers, Miguel and Roberto. A sister, Lucia. They live in Memphis and have never stopped looking for you. Tears began to flow down her face, but this time they were different. They weren't tears of despair, they were tears of relief. They've been looking for me? Every day for the last 28 years. Sarah closed her eyes and smiled for the first time in weeks. I have a real family. And they're going to save you, I promised. But as I mentally planned the trip to Memphis, a dark part of my mind was planning something else. Margaret Henley had destroyed lives for decades, profited from the suffering of families, and then lived a life of luxury with blood money. Finding Sarah's family was only the first step. Margaret didn't know it yet, but I wasn't just a desperate husband trying to save his wife. I was a software engineer, a digital security expert, and I had spent the last 3 months doing something she would never have imagined, meticulously documenting every crime she had ever committed. If you're following this journey in search of the truth, subscribe to the channel because what happened when I arrived in Memphis changed everything. Because as I drove down the dark road toward the family Sarah never knew she had, I was already executing the first phase of a plan that would ensure Margaret Henley paid for every life she destroyed. The difference was that this time, she wouldn't be able to hide behind bureaucracy and falsified records. This time, she would face real consequences. The drive to Memphis took 2.5 hours, but it felt like 2 eternities. My mind oscillated between hope and terror, hope that the Delgado family could save Sarah, terror that we would arrive too late. But during those lonely hours on the road, something else began to brew inside me. Pure rage against Margaret Henley. I called Amanda Rodriguez on the way. John, I got more information on Sarah's case, she said. Margaret didn't just separate her from her parents. She has documents proving that she altered medical records, forged death certificates, and even intimidated families trying to find their children. Intimidated how? False legal threats, fictitious lawsuits, even unauthorized police visits. She turned the adoption system into a personal profit machine. I felt my jaw clench. How many families were affected? At least 300 that we've been able to document. But it could be twice that. 300 families. 600 parents who mourned living children. Hundreds of children who grew up thinking they had no one in the world. Amanda, I need something. I want every document, every piece of evidence, everything you have on Margaret Henley. John, I know you're angry, but... It's not just anger, I interrupted. It's justice. This woman destroyed lives for decades and is living in a mansion bought with blood. My wife is dying because Margaret decided to play God. This can't go on. Amanda was silent for a moment. I'll email you everything. But John, what are you planning to do? I'm not sure yet. But Margaret Henley is going to pay for what she did. The Delgado family home was small but immaculate, with a flower-filled garden and an American flag flying from the porch. When I rang the doorbell, a gray-haired Latina woman opened the door. As soon as she saw me, her eyes widened. You came to talk about our daughter? I had rehearsed this moment in my head dozens of times during the trip, but when the time came, the words just came out. I found Sarah. She's alive. Maria Delgado collapsed into my arms, sobbing uncontrollably. A man came running out of the kitchen, Carlos presumably, and when he saw his wife crying and heard me repeat the words, he began to cry as well. Our girl, he whispered. Our little Sarah. The next few minutes were a blur of tears, hugs, and frantic questions. When we finally sat down in the living room, surrounded by family photos with an empty space where Sarah should have been, I told them everything. About her illness, about the urgent need for a transplant, about how Margaret Henley had lied to them all for 28 years. That woman, Carlos said, his voice shaking with anger. That terrible woman said our Sarah had died. We had a funeral, John. We buried an empty coffin. She told us we were too young, too poor to raise a child, Maria added. She said Sarah would be better off without us. I looked around the house. It was simple, but it overflowed with love. Photos of Miguel, Roberto, and Lucia at all stages of their lives. Graduation diplomas on the walls. A close-knit family that never stopped searching for their lost daughter. Margaret had stolen 28 years from this family. 28 years of birthdays, graduations, weddings, grandchildren. All because she thought she knew what was best for everyone. We need to go to Nashville now, I said. Sarah doesn't have much time. Within 3 hours, the entire Delgado family was at the hospital. The moment Sarah saw her parents for the first time while conscious was indescribable. Maria held her daughter's face with trembling hands, whispering mi Nina, mi pequeña Nina repeatedly. Carlos cried silently as he held Sarah's hand, and her brothers Miguel, Roberto, and Lucia stood around the bed, all touching her gently, as if they needed to confirm that she was real. Did you never stop looking for me? Sarah whispered. Never, Miguel replied. We never gave up. We knew you were out there somewhere. Compatibility tests were done immediately. Roberto, the oldest brother, was a perfect match. When can we do the surgery? He asked Dr. Peterson. Tomorrow morning, if you're ready. I've been ready for 28 years, Roberto replied. That night, as the Delgado family took turns at Sarah's bedside, I logged onto the hospital's internet and began working on what would become the most important project of my life. Margaret Henley had destroyed hundreds of families, profited from human suffering, and then retired to a mansion bought with blood money. But she had made one crucial mistake: she had messed with the wrong family. As a software engineer specializing in digital security, I had skills Margaret could never have imagined. I spent the night creating a detailed website documenting every crime she had committed, every family she had destroyed, every life she had ruined. But that was just the beginning. Through the documents Amanda sent me, I discovered that Margaret still ran private adoption consultancies. She was still profiting from separating families, still playing God with innocent lives. And I discovered something else: she had been lying on her taxes for decades, hiding millions in offshore accounts. If you're following this journey of a family reunited and justice being served, subscribe to the channel because what I have planned for Margaret Henley goes beyond any revenge she could ever imagine. The next morning, as Roberto entered the operating room to save his sister's life, I was finalizing the details of a plan that would ensure Margaret Henley would never hurt anyone again. She had spent decades hiding behind bureaucracy and institutional corruption. But now she would face something she had no defense against: the complete truth, exposed to the entire world, with irrefutable evidence of every crime she had committed. Margaret Henley was about to find out what happens when you mess with the wrong family. And this time, there would be no hiding. Roberto's surgery began at 6 in the morning. While my brother-in-law saved my wife's life in the operating room, I was in the waiting room executing the final phase of my plan against Margaret Henley. At 7:45, I published the website. The Truth About Margaret Henley, 25 Years of Destroyed Families went live with complete documentation of 317 cases of illegal family separation, evidence of bribery, document forgery, and tax evasion on an industrial scale. But that was just the beginning. At 8 p.m., I sent copies of all the documents to the Nashville scene, the Tennessean, 3 local television stations, and the FBI. Simultaneously, I fired off personalized emails to every affected family I could track down, explaining exactly what had happened to their children. At 8:15, my phone rang. "Who are you and what the hell do you want?" Margaret's voice was unrecognizable with rage. "I'm John Mitchell. husband of Sarah, whom you condemned to death. You have no idea what you've just done, kid. I'm going to sue you for defamation, slander, invasion of privacy. With what money? I interrupted calmly. Because at 8 o'clock this morning, the Internal Revenue Service received complete documentation of your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. $23 million undeclared over 15 years. Silence on the other end of the line. Impossible. Those accounts are secret? They were. Until I hacked into your private consultant's emails. Did you really think you could continue selling babies in 2024 using the same methods you used in the 1990s? I heard her breathing quicken. You can't prove anything. Margaret, as we speak, Channel 5's investigative report is broadcasting a special report on you. Want to know what else I found out? I didn't wait for an answer. I found out that you never stopped. Your consulting firm, Bright Futures Adoption Services, has separated 42 families in the last 5 years alone. Latino and Black families whose children were relocated to wealthy white families who paid between $50,000 and $80,000 per child. That's ridiculous. Jennifer Martinez, 2 years old, separated from her parents in 2020. Carlos Reeves, 3 years old, taken from his grandmother in 2021. Shall I go on? From the first genuine panic in her voice, I knew I had hit home. What do you want? She whispered. Justice. I hung up and turned my attention back to the operating room, where the red light had finally gone out. Dr. Peterson emerged with a weary smile. The surgery went perfectly. Roberto is an exceptional donor, and Sarah responded better than we expected. For the first time in months, I was able to breathe fully. 2 hours later, as Sarah slept in recovery surrounded by the Delgado family, my phone rang again. It was Amanda Rodriguez. John, I don't know what you've done, but it's total chaos here. Margaret's office has been raided by the FBI, 3 families have filed lawsuits, and Channel 5 is broadcasting live interviews with parents who have found children they haven't seen in decades. And Margaret. Arrested. Charges of tax fraud, child trafficking, falsification of federal documents. Bail has been denied. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call. It was Maria Santos, one of the mothers whose son had been stolen by Margaret in 2002. Senor John, she said, crying. For 22 years I searched for my Miguel. Today, thanks to what you did, he called me. He's been living 15 minutes from my house all this time. Similar calls came in throughout the afternoon. Parents finding children. Siblings reuniting. Families being reunited after decades of forced separation. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Sarah woke up. Her color was better, and for the first time in months, she smiled a genuine smile. How do you feel? I asked, gently holding her hand. Like I'm going to live, she whispered. Roberto. Your brother is fine. He saved your life. Sarah closed her eyes, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. And Margaret. Margaret won't hurt anyone else. That night, the local news led with the story. Adoption scandal exposed. Former government employee accused of child trafficking. The images showed Margaret being led away in handcuffs, her mansion being searched, and dozens of families gathering at the Nashville airport. The anchor ended the segment by saying, "This case came to light thanks to the efforts of a husband determined to save his wife, resulting in the exposure of crimes that affected hundreds of families over 25 years. But the real satisfaction came 3 days later. Sarah was sitting up in her hospital bed, strong enough to eat on her own, when a woman knocked on the door. It was Elena Rodriguez, one of the social workers who had worked under Margaret in the 1990s. I always knew something was wrong, she said, with tears in her eyes. But I was young, I was afraid of losing my job. When I saw the news about what you did, I needed to say thank you. She turned to Sarah. Your courage in searching for your family has brought justice to hundreds of people. You've saved many more lives than you realize. Sarah held my hand tightly. We saved them, she corrected. We did this together. When Elena left, Sarah looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't just love or gratitude. It was pride. Margaret thought she could decide who deserved to have a family, Sarah said softly. She thought people like my parents weren't good enough to raise me. And now? Sarah smiled, looking through the window where Carlos Delgado was teaching his granddaughter, Miguel's daughter, to ride a bike in the hospital courtyard. Now she's in a cell finding out what happens when you mess with the wrong family. The plan had worked perfectly. Margaret Henley had not only lost her freedom, her fortune, and her reputation. She had become the unwitting catalyst for the greatest family reunion in Tennessee history. And Sarah? Sarah had gained not only a second chance at life, but a family that loved her unconditionally from the moment they first laid eyes on her. Margaret had tried to play God with our lives. But she discovered that some games have consequences that last a lifetime. 6 months later, Sarah was standing in our kitchen making heart-shaped pancakes like she used to before her illness. Her hair had grown back, thicker than before, and her cheeks had that healthy pink color I thought I'd never see again. "You're looking at me with that silly face again," she said, smiling over her shoulder. "Sorry," I replied, hugging her from behind. "I'm still not used to the fact that you're going to stay." The doorbell rang, and soon the house was filled with a familiar sound of voices speaking Spanish and English at the same time. Every Sunday, the Delgado family came over for brunch. Maria always brought fresh flowers from her garden, Carlos carried his guitar to play after lunch, and Sarah's siblings, Roberto, Miguel, and Lucia, arrived with their children so the kids could play in the backyard. Our small 2-bedroom house suddenly felt huge, filled with laughter, stories, and the kind of unconditional love Sarah had been searching for her whole life without knowing it. During lunch, Miguel told us about the phone call he had received the week before. It was from a family in Oregon, he said. They saw the story about Margaret Henley and realized that their son, who was adopted in 2001, might be our cousin Elena's. Her parents never stopped looking for her. It was story number 73. 73 families reunited directly as a result of Margaret Henley's exposure. And new families were coming forward every week. Amanda Rodriguez had become a celebrity in the legal world, representing all of the families affected by Margaret's scheme for free. She called me regularly with updates. "John, you need to know," she said during our last conversation. "Margaret has been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Child trafficking, tax fraud, falsification of federal documents. There's no possibility of parole. And the money? Confiscated completely. $23 million she hid in offshore accounts is now being distributed as compensation to the affected families. The Delgado family will receive a significant amount for the 28 years that were stolen from Sarah." But true justice was not in the money or Margaret's imprisonment. True justice was in our living room that Sunday, where Sarah sat on the floor teaching her 5-year-old niece Isabella to play piano on the old keyboard we bought at a clearance sale. "Aunt Sarah," Isabella asked in her curious little voice, "why does Grandma Maria always cry when she looks at you?" Sarah smiled and stroked the girl's hair. "Because she lost me for a long time, my flower. And now she's very happy to have found me." Like hide and seek? Just like hide and seek. Only it lasted 28 years. Isabella thought about that for a moment, then said, "I bet Grandma is really good at looking." "The best in the world," Sarah replied, her own tears beginning to flow. Across the room, Carlos showed Roberto how to tune his new guitar, while Maria and Lucia organized old photo albums to show Sarah 28 years of birthdays, graduations, weddings, and family moments she had been deprived of. "Look here," Maria said, pointing to a faded photo. "This is Roberto on his first day of school. He carried his baby picture in his backpack all through first grade, telling the other kids he had a little sister who was coming home soon." Roberto, now a man of 32, blushed. "I really believed you would come back," he said to Sarah. "I never doubted it." "And I always felt like I had a family somewhere," Sarah replied. "I always had this hole in my chest, this feeling that something important was missing." That night, after everyone had left, Sarah and I sat on the porch watching the stars. It was a habit we had developed during her recovery, quiet moments where we simply appreciated the fact that we were alive and together. "You know what's funny?" Sarah said, holding my hand. "Margaret thought she was protecting me by separating me from my family. She said they were inadequate, too poor, too young. And what do you think about that now?" Sarah laughed softly. "I look at Carlos teaching Roberto to play guitar, at Maria making sure everyone has enough to eat, at Miguel telling stories about when they were kids, and I think Margaret was right about one thing." "What was that?" "They really shaped me. Even without knowing me, They shaped who I became. Because the love they felt for me during those 28 years, the way they never gave up looking for me, the way they accepted me instantly, it created an echo in the universe that somehow reached me. She paused, looking up at the stars. I always knew how to love unconditionally, John. Even without a family to teach me, I knew. And now I understand why. Because they were loving me from afar all this time. 3 months later, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Elena Rodriguez, the former social worker who had worked under Margaret Henley. John, there's something you need to know, she said. Margaret asked to talk to me at the prison. What did she want? She asked me to give you a message. She said she finally understood what she did wrong. Not just to Sarah, but to all the families. I was silent, processing this. She said she spent her whole life thinking she knew what was best for everyone, but that in prison, surrounded by women who had also been separated from their children by circumstances beyond their control, she finally understood what family really means. And what does it mean? That it's not about having enough money or the perfect house or the ideal circumstances. It's about unconditional love and never giving up on the people who matter. Elena paused. She said that if she could go back in time, she would reunite all the families immediately. And that you saved many more lives than you realize. When I told Sarah this, she was thoughtful for a long time. You know, she finally said, I don't feel angry at Margaret. I feel sorry for her. She wasted a lifetime trying to control something that should never be controlled. Which is the power of family love. On Roberto's first transplant anniversary, we threw a party in the backyard. Not just for our family, but for all the families that had been brought together as a result of our journey. There were children running between the tables, parents hugging children they thought they would never see again, siblings meeting each other for the first time as adults. Amanda Rodriguez was there with her own family, along with several of the lawyers who had worked on the cases. When it came time for toasts, Roberto stood up with a glass in his hand. A year ago, he said, his voice heavy with emotion, I was just a man who grew up knowing he had a sister lost somewhere in the world. Today, not only have I regained my sister, but I have gained a courageous brother-in-law who refused to accept that some injustices are irreversible. He looked directly at me. John, you didn't just save Sarah's life. You saved our entire family. And dozens of other families. The applause was deafening, but what really touched me were the tears in Sarah's eyes as she looked around the yard filled with people who a year ago were strangers, and now were family. Later that night, as we were clearing the dishes, Sarah took me by the arm. Can I ask you a question? Sure. If you had known at the beginning that saving my life would mean destroying Margaret Henley's life, would you still have done it? I thought carefully before answering. Margaret destroyed her own life the moment she decided to separate babies from their families for money. I just made the consequences visible. Sarah nodded. That's what I think too. Sometimes justice is slow, but it always comes. Today, 2 years later, Sarah works as a counselor for families affected by troubled adoptions. Roberto has started a foundation that helps reunite families separated by the system. And me? I've gone back to my job as a software engineer, but now I devote all my free time to a special project, a national database that helps families find each other more quickly. Margaret Henley is serving her sentence in a federal prison in Texas. I hear she works in the prison library, helping other inmates write letters to their families. I don't know if this represents a true change of heart or just an attempt to earn points toward a possible reduction in her sentence. But I choose to believe that people can change, even after they've caused so much harm. The last time I visited the imaginary grave that Maria and Carlos made for Sarah, now turned into a memorial garden for all the children lost in the system, I found fresh flowers and a note. To all the children who have been separated from their families, you are not forgotten. You are loved. And it's never too late to find your way home. A grandmother who understands. It was signed simply M.H. Margaret had left flowers at the memorial of her own victim. If you've come this far on this journey of family, justice, and second chances, subscribe to the channel for more stories of people who refuse to accept that some injustices are permanent. Because sometimes, all we need is one person willing to fight for what's right. The truth is, Margaret Henley tried to play God with our lives, arbitrarily deciding who deserved a family and who didn't. She thought she could rewrite the history of hundreds of families based on her own prejudices and greed. But there's something about family love that transcends any system, any bureaucracy, any person who tries to come between parents and children. Love finds a way. It always does. And in the end, while Margaret counts the days in a cold cell, Sarah wakes up every morning in a house filled with laughter, hugs, and the kind of unconditional love that some people spend their entire lives searching for. She didn't have to search any longer. Because her family never stopped searching for her. And me? Well, I've learned that sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't destroying your enemy, but building something so beautiful and lasting that it renders all attempts at destruction irrelevant. Margaret tried to break us. Instead, she made us unbreakable.